Kim Linton. Hello and welcome to our Women in Lymphoma webinar. My name is Kim Linton from the UK, and I'm delighted to be joined by my co-chair today, Astrid Pawlowski from Buenos Aires. So the topic for this series is indolent lymphoma, and we really have a fantastic lineup of international speakers and talks over the next 5 Wednesdays, including a session that's dedicated to our male champions for change in week 4, which is the 27th of October. And before I introduce today's speakers and talks, I'd like to just pass our huge thanks to our WiL Steering Committee, to Anna Steiner and to the Snowdome Foundation for your help and support in putting together this series. I'd also like to thank Rachel Oakley for stepping in to provide the administrative support for us today, and also our pharma partners, BMS, WiLing and Janssen Australia, for your tremendous sponsorship. So the format for today's talks will be 2 speakers and question time after each talk. The session will last approximately an hour, and we'll be recording the session for those of you who wish to catch up later or need to dash off if you've got clinical and other commitments. So if I could perhaps ask everybody just to mute your microphones and cameras during the presentation, but do feel free to post your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll really try and answer as many of these as we can during the session. So during the Q&A, if I can also ask all our WiL panel members to turn your camera on and raise your electronic hand if you've got any questions. So Astrid and I will do our very best to alternate questions between our audience questions and our panel members. And so with that preamble, it gives me huge pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Lady Nicola Mendelsohn is going to be talking on the topic of living with follicular lymphoma. So Nicola has a stellar career. She's Vice President for Facebook in Europe, Middle East and Africa. She's held that role since 2013, and before that she had a stellar career in advertising. She is also, though, a patient with follicular lymphoma, and she has launched the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation, which I'm sure she'll be telling us a little bit about. This is an international charity that's devoted to raising funds to support patients with follicular lymphoma. Nicola is also a really vocal advocate for women achieving their potential, and she's an incredible role model for us, particularly our early career researchers and our rising stars. So we really are truly honoured to have you here with us today, Nicola, and to open our series. And when you're ready, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. I couldn't be more grateful to you and to Astrid for the invitation. And it really is an enormous privilege for me to be speaking here today at the webinar. Kim, I am particularly indebted to you for your help, but also for introducing me to this group as well. I read very recently the definitive research illustrating the disadvantage that women researchers have in being allocated grants and advancement. And so I'm really pleased that there's organisations like yours agitating for proper recognition and acknowledgement. And I hope that I and the charity I run will find a way to be true and effective partners. Now, I thought I'd share with you 6 things that I've learned and ideas that I've developed along my journey. 6 quick points that I hope will highlight what we're doing, and then leave some time for some questions before handing the mic over to Dr. Jessica Okosun. I am sure that many of you know Jessica, but I am hugely blessed to have met her, to work with her, and just know that she is completely brilliant. So here goes. Here's my 6 points. Number 1, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. In November 2016, I was diagnosed with follicular lymphoma when I was 45. I remember being told it was a good cancer to get, that I probably wouldn't die from it, but with it. But the lived experience of patients is that this disease is actually a life sentence. It's chronic. And the subsequent 6 to 8 treatments that a typical patient will endure will weaken their immune system, change their mental well-being. And even if they technically don't die from FL in some way, it will have contributed to their demise. This feeling and the powerful voices of patients has been something that's influenced my work on FL. Number 2, it's always darkest at the bottom of the lighthouse. Now, I am embarrassed to say that despite my job at Facebook, it took me about 3 months before I even thought of looking on Facebook to see if there was a group or some people on there who were living with follicular lymphoma. I found a fledgling group of 600 people that the group had been set up by an amazing lady called Nikki out in Australia. And together, she and I now co-admin this group, which has now grown to be over 8,000 people living with follicular lymphoma globally. It's an amazing source of support and advice for patients. People ask each other all sorts of questions in the group, ranging from things like, will I lose my hair during chemo? Or why am I having nosebleeds? Or look at this picture of something. What do you think? Anybody else got that? And there's another whole side as well of the group, the lifelong friendships that have been formed. There was one example that really touched me, was from a member who posted, and this was before COVID, about how he was really struggling with treatment, how he was feeling really lonely. And there was another member of the group who happened to be living nearby and having treatment at the same hospital, offered to sit with him, to go there, sit with him throughout the treatment, and then go for a treat lunch afterwards. Now, let me tell you, there is a Facebook group like this out there for so many of the different lymphomas. But to me, this group really demonstrates something special, and actually something we've seen a lot through the pandemic, and that's the power of community and the power of collaboration. The group's also been, I've been told, a great source of information for clinicians and researchers, because being part of it is a great way to see patterns that you might not see in the clinic, but it also raises different questions that should be asked about the disease. Number 3, listen to the ambition of where science can be, not just where it is. Now, the more I went on my journey, the more people I spoke to, well, the more I became convinced that perhaps this was the right time for the incurable FL to be cured, almost 100 years since the disease was first discovered, that the science, the researchers, and the resources could align to find a cure. Now, one of those people that I was blessed to meet was the incredible Jessica Okosun, and I just want to pay tribute to her for the work that she does and for the impact that she's making for lymphoma patients, especially FL patients globally. She's a critical advisor to me, providing not just tempered and measured optimism about where progress can be made, but also in helpfully navigating and thinking through all the challenges that there may be along the way. So thank you, Jessica. And certainly, notwithstanding those challenges to make cure possible, in 2021, most of the people who either scoffed or gently tried to persuade me to lower my ambitions just a few years earlier are now actually either fully on board for the mission of cure or getting pretty close to that. And so I do think that this seems like it is a very, very exciting time to be in medical research. Number 4, if you're convinced something should be done, consider doing it. It was this combination of the bringing together of patients and the support and the belief of the scientific community that led me to setting up the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation, the world's first charity dedicated solely to FL. We have a very clear mission and mandate at the charity to look for a cure or cures as quickly as possible. Now, we don't want to duplicate what others are doing. We want to partner, to learn, and to collaborate. And in the same way that I've learned so much from the clinical and research communities, I've also become very aware of the improvements to those working to provide resource and capacity for achieving and supporting improvements in health outcomes. And so here I am personally hugely grateful to Mike Milken, the founder of the Prostate Cancer Foundation, and the incredible Kathy Justy, the founder of the Multiple Myeloma Foundation, who've been so exceptionally generous with their time, opened up their playbooks so we don't make the same mistakes that they made. And thus we have literally, I can say, confidently be able to say, saved millions of dollars and years of time. Those interactions have also led me to become a member of the Craft Precision Medicine Accelerator Program at Harvard Business School. It is a wonderful program, an amazing network based around disease-focused organizations. They provide insight, resources, and also a fantastic means of sharing best practices. There is so much going on that can think of new ways to achieve advancement, that my other thing here is that you have got to be a really good and active listener. Number 5, learn fast, especially if you set off in the wrong direction. Now, we started looking at what we could usefully do in 2018. And I'm going to be honest with you, at the beginning, I did make some mistakes. Sometimes I followed an obviously too easy path. I took too limited a view on the necessary chain of events that would be required. And thanks to others, including the people I've already mentioned, we worked really hard to learn how and what useful role that we could play within the existing tapestry to provide focus and acceleration. We took a great deal of time to find the right mechanism, the right projects, the partners, and the strategies. And so in November 2019, we launched the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation. It is, as I said, the first charity to solely focus on FL. And the ultimate ambition of the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation is to lead new and determined efforts to find a cure for FL and to get treatments to patients quicker than ever before. We're rolling out our first 3 programs and really hoping to make rapid progress on all of them. The first is a project to mobilize the patient community to fuel a targeted acceleration in data and research, a precision medicine project. And it's going to provide a rich source of information to patients and their clinicians, as well as researchers and biotech. And also, hopefully, play a useful part in helping to shape the treatment path for patients and ensure that the right and better treatments are available that will keep the immune systems of patients in the best possible condition for the longest time. This project rests on a registry, biobanking, a data analysis platform, and an effective relationship with the research, biotech, and pharma community to power research. Registry recruitment will start in 2022. The second project is a series of partnerships with key institutions where we believe there's sufficient depth to provide the strongest multidisciplinary approach, as well as strategically important research initiatives. There's going to be a limited number of these centers of excellence, but we're really looking for great long-term relationships. And thanks to the exceptional leadership and vision of Dr. Laurie Glimsher, we've already started an effort with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, and we're really excited about where these partnerships are going to go. We've got 2 further centers of excellence established in the next few months, and 1 more also in development. The third project is a therapeutic development initiative, which will be seeking to fund the acceleration of new therapies. We've spent the last 6 months researching, consulting, and debating a prioritized target pad for us to back research which has the highest chance in the quickest time to provide these solutions. We're now about to start to share the results of this work and launch a request for proposals at the beginning of 2022, so not long to go. Curing FL is going to require a whole toolkit of therapies, given the heterogeneity of the disease. Multiple types of patients mean multiple cures are going to be required. Nevertheless, we're focusing the awards this year on advancing immunotherapy and targeted therapy. We are really keen to reach as far as we can to seek out great projects to back. And we're also really keen to generate a great deal of debate about priorities and opportunities. And so the focus of this effort will change based on where the scientific consensus is, but we're also keen to make sure that other voices and ideas are able to break through and be considered. But I also really hope that you keep an eye out for the launch of the RFP and consider it as an opportunity for this year or next year, or whenever you are ready. And my final point, number 6, diversity is equality, which in turn is opportunity. It's a deeply personal one. I've long been an advocate for opportunities and rights for women. And the mission statement of Women in Lymphoma, supporting and advocating for greater leadership of women in lymphoma globally, well, it settles powerfully on me. And when you say that you're committed to supporting and advocating for greater leadership of women in lymphoma globally, I really hope that this means that you're going to be willing to work with us. I would like nothing more than for a woman to take the lead in the search for a cure for FL. And I truly hope that we can create something together that would make that possible. So thank you for each and every one of you for the crucial work that you do in all areas of lymphoma, for carrying the torch for future generations of great researchers, for teachers, and also for your kindness in inviting me and listening to me. Thank you.
Nicola, thank you. That was an absolutely fantastic talk, and we are so privileged to have you speaking with us today. I think, you know, this is exactly the sort of thing that we're hoping for our aspiring young career women who are trying to reach their potential. And I think if I can summarize your 6-point plan that you so eloquently described for us, I think you said start small, collaborate, push the boundaries of science, be proactive, learn fast, and remember diversity and equality are opportunities, and particularly when it comes to allowing women and enabling women to achieve their potential. So that's something we will, that's a really fantastic framework for us to work on. I think if I just want to start the questioning off with some inspiring words that you might give to our early career researchers, what would be the one thing that you would advise them in terms of how to get their career to the next stage of the ladder, particularly when they're trying to balance busy family and working lives, as you have clearly had to do, both before and after your diagnosis of follicular lymphoma?
First of all, I think you surmised my speech much better than me, so I'm going to steal back your summation. So thank you for that, and hello again to everybody that is listening. So many things to share on this one. If I think back to my younger self, and for context also, I have 4 children. So you know, that's my, without question, my greatest achievement. I would say, and I love a bit of Eleanor Roosevelt here, do the things you think you cannot do. Because when you do the things that scare you, terrify you, take you out of your comfort zone, give you those kind of goosebumps and sort of icky feeling in your tummy, honestly, I promise you, that is the time that you learn the most. That's the time you're pushing yourself. And if you're just kind of feeling comfortable, then you are not going fast enough. You're not developing yourself and you're not learning. And that's just a criminal shame, because every day is so precious, so special. So you can do it. And the other thing I would say is put your hand up. There were too many times when I was having these exhausting conversations in my head when I was younger in Korea. And, you know, by the time I'd had the whole conversation in my head, some bloke had put his hand up, said the point, and I'd be like going, I was going to say that, but like nobody knows. And then I think, what's the worst thing that could have happened if I'd have said it? It was like, maybe it wouldn't have been a good point. I wasn't going to get fired for that, but that's just some things that I think about like that.
So face your fears and don't sit back quietly.
Definitely. Don't you think that's true, Kim, Astrid?
I think, I mean, it's the hardest thing, you know, facing your fears when you know you're going to be scrutinized and you know you might not perform, and there's all those fears and negative thoughts coming into your mind. It is what holds most of us back, I think. But facing our fears is something, I think, you go back to step 1 of what your 6-point plan was, start small, and I guess build up from there.
Yeah, and also having a learning mentality, which of course you all have anyway. That's the whole of science, is about learning. And it's taking those failures, applying it to yourself as well, going, I'm not going to get everything right, and that's fine. You know, my day job at Facebook, and look, we're having a busy week at the moment, granted, around the world, but we embrace failure and failing hard, but we take the failures that we have and we learn from them and we build back better. That is the basis of any tech company. We're always iterating, always learning. And actually there's a lot that's similar in the scientific community from that respect as well. What's really the worst that could ever happen? I've forced women sometimes that I've mentored to write down the worst thing. And when they actually articulate it and write it down in the there and the now, it's really not that terrible. But I tell you something that I think women do much worse than men. It's the catastrophizing, where you keep going, but then this happens, and therefore that and that and that. And you know, I did that. The worst point in my life was the weekend of my diagnosis of cancer. I literally went through the whole thing of, and therefore I'm going to die. The kids are going to have a terrible stepmother, you know, blah, blah, and their life, everybody's lives are going to be a disaster. And I'm like, why have I just given that energy away? None of that's true. None of that's true, but we all do that. And And we got to stop because it's exhausting and doesn't get us anywhere.
No, that's incredibly true. Can I just ask our panel members to just put your cameras on if you want to ask some questions, and then Astrid and I know who you are.
I would say to people as well, you can ask me questions on anything. I'm super comfortable with asking questions. No such thing as a bad question.
Nicola, I want to ask you, thank you very much for your inspiring talk. And I think giving the diagnosis of follicular lymphoma is very difficult because we're talking about a chronic disease. Many times we are advising our patients not to receive therapy. So I think it's very important to manage the correct information and the timing of the information. So could you give us an advice on how you lived it and what do you think it's necessary for us as physicians to help on that terrible week that you mentioned on the week of your diagnosis?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. So here's me talking, laying it all bare as a patient. You can't hear anything past the word cancer. And I think, and especially for me, the person that presents like me, there was nothing wrong with me, technically. Obviously there was, but I was living a busier, full life. And my only symptom was a tiny lump in my groin. And as a woman, you're never told to check your groin, are you? Like, nobody knows the symptoms of blood cancer. Well, you all do, but nobody in the general public knows the symptoms of blood cancer. So it wasn't something that you check for. And truly, I was lucky because my very close girlfriend is a GP and she's the one that made me go and get diagnosed. Otherwise, you know, I'd have got sicker at some point and then would have presented with something else. I've thought about this a lot, actually. And I think there's something around the time. Well, first off, now there's a site that you can tell people to go and check out our website, the Follicular Lymphoma Foundation, where there's lots of patients that have shared their stories. So that's definitely a place that people can go to. And I would encourage everybody to go there. But the second thing to say is you'll hear the word cancer and you'll probably think it's cancer like a breast cancer or a prostate cancer, which, if you like, are famous cancers. This cancer is different. The languages around it is different. The treatments around it are different. You know, I thought all chemotherapy, you would have to lose your hair. I never heard of watching where I would use language like that. You know, it is more like a chronic disease. There was a great analogy that I think it was John Leonard told me, which is that your cancer is going to be like a hitchhiker. And he said to me, this cancer of yours, you want to keep it in the boot of your car. You don't really want a hitchhiker in your car, but okay, you've got it. It's on the journey with you. And every now and then, the hitchhiker is going to want to get in the front of your car, and we're going to have to stop the car, get it out, and move it back into the boot. And, you know, I would talk about the fact that people do live a long time with this. I would like paint that broader picture, but it's other people's cancers are not your cancer. The language that you hear, you're going to beat this and you're a warrior. And it's very different to how it is to live with something. The diabetes is quite a useful thing because you go, that's not as scary, but it does take time to bridge to that conversation and get that into your head as a new type of language. Thanks for asking that. Kate was going to ask me a similar question.
I think Kate's I've just said, Kate, do you still have a question? And she said it was the same one, but I wanted to continue that theme because we can learn so much from the patient voice. And when it comes to prioritizing and planning our research going forward, we have no idea really about what matters most to our patients with follicular lymphoma. We've been talking a little bit now about diagnosis and information and how you provide that, but thinking ahead about your ambition to cure follicular lymphoma, what sort of patient prioritized research do you think we should be focusing on as a patient with follicular lymphoma?
Yeah, well, we asked the patients this, and so it was the first thing that I do, which is I'm leading this as a patient-led, as a patient myself, but as a patient-led organization with 8,000 patients behind me, the largest gathering of patients of FL ever. They want to know what order treatments, what will give them the best options of success that will push it out for as long as possible. They want to understand the trade-offs better. Do you blast it with an R-CHOP now? Are you better with something lighter? You know, why a clinical trial? There's a lot of, you know, scare things around clinical trials. So they want to just have a much bigger picture, and they want to understand it more based on that person's follicular lymphoma versus the next one. I think it's starting to seep out now. that actually in the future, we won't treat everybody's breast cancer in the same way. They'll be based on your genetic mutations, etc. So that socialization and also the research being targeted into those different areas based on what actually your makeup is, I think is what something wants to see. Because, you know, if you actually say to someone, which was the decision I took, I decided to watch and wait until I couldn't anymore. And I'm so glad, because then I was able to have obinutuzumab. And if I'd have had my treatment in 2018, the UK hadn't approved obinutuzumab at that point. So based on the research, the data, it's going to hopefully give me longer till my next treatment than if I'd have had rituximab. So I think it's having those sort of informed conversations. That's what they want to know.
And hopefully a lot of the research that we're doing is getting us there. Certainly we'll hear more about personalized medicine from Jess and Carla later in the series. I think the sequencing of therapies is something we all want to know, what the best sequence is and how should we start intensively, start light, and how do you do it? I think we're starting to get some understanding of that, and we'll hear more about that from our speakers, you know, about the importance of complete remission. And I'm sure Judith has got a hand up. She might talk about aspiring to achieve a complete metabolic remission first time round. But I think what you're asking for is some of the biggest challenges we're facing in our follicular lymphoma research.
Yeah, and the other bit that I would add to that is the patient wants to know. A lot of patients, some patients want to put their head in the sand and go, I'll have my treatment, I'll get on with it, and I'll let you know. But there's another big group of patients go, what can I actively do between treatments to get my body stronger? And I know there's a lot of doctors out there reluctant to say you must do this, because there isn't the, you know, the medical evidence for follicular lymphoma that if you eat a healthy diet, if you exercise, and actually having something as a framework to hold on to is very helpful for a patient. It's very helpful for them to know that if I take my vitamins, you know what, one of the places I went to didn't even prescribe vitamin D. Now you've written the papers and you've got the research to say that vitamin D will actively increase, you know, the positive outcomes for an FL patient. That should just be standard to, you know, to check when you have the blood test. That should be standard as that this is a good thing to do, because it empowers the patient to feel that they're helping to make their body stronger. I'm seeing Judith's hand.
Hello, Nicola. Thank you very much. I really was very inspired by your talk, and every now and then we definitely need fuel. I've got a couple of comments and questions. First, and I'll try and be quick because I noticed the time clocking. Firstly, I love your comment about catastrophizing, and sometimes it pays to catastrophize and think what's the worst possible thing that can happen. I particularly loved it in the context of your example, because I am that wicked stepmother, and I like to think our large blended family has turned out very fine. And I think you're absolutely right about facing those fears and making those small steps. The one thing I would add is, particularly in all of us forming WIL, is the power of community. That really helps you face those small steps. And, you know, none of our fears have been realised at all in this journey with WIL. Can I just perhaps quickly ask you one comment about the word cure? It's a very sexy word. It's a very powerful word. Do you think sometimes it's not a destructive word, but it sometimes gets in the way when, you know, what is cure anyway? You know, it's really hard to pin down and define what it is, particularly for the patient with follicular lymphoma.
Yeah. And this was really, it was really interesting when I started on this journey, because look, as a patient, you go, well, I want a cure. Why can't I have a cure? That's what I want. And, you know, if we put money into the problem, surely we should be able to get there. Honestly, I was poo-pooed and laughed at. And I have to say it was largely by men who said, don't be, and actually a lot of British men who said, don't be so ridiculous. That's just a crazy thing. It was when I went to the US, actually, and went and learned and understood what was going on and agitated more. Actually, people started to think about, well, why can't we cure the incurable? Just because it's always been the status quo. So that got me thinking then, okay. And then I look at the advances in medicine and the things that we've done in the last, you know, 50 years, not even just in medicine, but in tech, and especially, and with data and AI. And you bring together this perfect storm. It's actually, I think we should be able to. And what it will mean is not just one. It's not going to be a holy grail and da-da, here's the pill that will answer, the red shiny thing that will work for all. I think it's going to be a combination of different things, but it'll be that openness to say that actually, yes, we will get there with FL. It might take 100 different types of things, and we'll take the learnings from the other cancers that share the same mutations and challenges, and we'll bring those all together into the smorgasbord of offering. Back to the earlier question, that we will then be able to talk on a Nicola basis, not on a follicular lymphoma basis, or a Judith or a Kate basis or a Kim basis. Like, this is how we'll go about addressing it for you. So yes, it's a sexy word, but when you get into the grit of it, it's a lot of hard bloody work that will sit behind multiple ones of cure rather than the one to solve them all. I'd love the one to solve them all, but I think we're some way off that for cancer.
Thank you so much, Nicola.
Thank you.
Well said, Nicola. I think pushing the boundaries of science and saying why not is absolutely where we need to be. And I think that is a fantastic introduction actually to our next speaker, Jess Okosun, who is going to be talking to us a little bit about the pathogenesis of follicular lymphoma, the clonal evolution and patterns of transformation, which might just hold the clues to some of the cures that you're aspiring to. So thank you so much, Nicola, for that fantastic and inspiring talk. I've no doubt it is going to provide a fantastic framework for us going forward. And thank you also for your really lovely tribute to Jess. I think the patient-doctor relationship is such a powerful one, and we can learn so much from each other. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jess, our next speaker. Jess is well known to many of us around the UK. She's an assistant professor and a clinical scientist at the Barts Cancer Institute, where she's also practicing as a consultant hematologist looking after lymphoma patients. She has a specialist interest in lymphoma, and her research is very much focused on looking at lymphoma development, the heterogeneity of evolution, as well as translating biomarkers into the clinic. She has, not surprisingly, received many awards for her groundbreaking research, and she holds numerous leadership positions, both nationally and internationally. So we're absolutely delighted, Jess, to have you join Nicola on the podium today. And if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Kim. How do I follow Nicola? I think very generous words from Nicola, but also really thank you to the WiLing Committee for inviting me to speak. I'm very honored to be part of this important alliance that is important for advocating for women. And I think that, I think Nicola has said it very well. I think diversity is really a key to kind of research excellence, and it's important to continue to include a number of voices at the table. So I feel that as part of the WiLing history that I may have actually the longest talk title, so I've actually shortened it a little bit. And I'm going to focus on talking about the biology of follicular lymphoma, particularly from the kind of the context of the sort of genetic lens. And I may just sort of bring a perspective of how we may start to, bring this sort of biological insights into the clinic. So I just need to just check that the screen is sharing and it's in the right mode. Is it okay, or is it still?
It's okay, Jess. We can see
okay.
it.
Perfect. Okay. Is that okay? Perfect. So I think to such a learned audience, in the room, I perhaps don't need to really overemphasize that we as physicians and clinicians, we see a spectrum in clinical behavior. We have some patients that are asymptomatic, may not require therapy at all. And on the other hand, we have a group of patients that exhibit sort of high-risk behavior that are perhaps still underserved by our current standard therapies. I know that there are going to be talks later in this series that will focus on this subset of patients, but it's important to just emphasize the spectrum in clinical behavior. So, just to give you an example of this sort of dichotomy in clinical behavior, these are two patients that I've had the privilege to look after in the clinic, but also to study their lymphomas in the laboratory. The first patient perhaps exhibits the kind of classic protracted relapsing remitting clinical course. Her disease history or clinical history spans over 25 years, and it's punctuated, as you can see, by multiple courses of treatment and periods of remission as well. The second patient exhibits this sort of high-risk clinical behavior, is diagnosed with follicular lymphoma, and unfortunately, within 2 to 3 years, progresses to transformed lymphoma, and unfortunately dies during the course of their treatment. I put these two patients up really to really exemplify, one, of course, the high-risk group of patients, but also for the patients that are living for 20 plus years. You know, we have to really think about the quality of life also in these patients that are receiving multiple lines of therapy, and the anxieties that are associated with living with a mostly incurable lymphoma. So let's switch to the biology. So we, you know, in the sort of early 80s, we identified this sort of translocation in follicular lymphoma. So this 1418 translocation that leads to, you okay, Kim?
I'm ever so sorry, Jess. I don't think your slides are moving ahead. So
okay,
we're still on slide 1. Apologies to interrupt.
Okay, is that better? Can you see?
Yeah, that is definitely there. And maybe if you just advance them one by one, that would be perfect.
Okay, perfect. Let's
apologies. Thank you.
No, not at all. Problem with so many screens. So simple understanding of the biology in the 1980s, and you know, if we roll the clock now, you know, over 30 years later, we can see that the biology is much more complex. You know, we have a better understanding of the genetics, the epigenetics of these lymphomas, but also of the microenvironment and heterogeneity, which is an area that I'm particularly interested in. So really, you know, these lymphomas are very complex in a multitude of ways. So this 1418 translocation has always been thought of as a sort of primary genetic hallmark. It's present in about 85 to 90% of patients with follicular lymphoma, but we know that there are 30 to 40% of healthy individuals can carry very low levels of the 1418 in the peripheral blood. And this is from really elegant work, you know, over the years from Sandrine Rouland and colleagues in Marseille. And so we've known that the 1418 is important, but it's not sufficient for the development of follicular lymphoma. So the question is, well, what are the additional genetic events? And so there are studies that have shown that there may be a pre-malignant or an intermediate phase. So, and we can identify that there are these follicular lymphoma-like cells in the peripheral blood. And also there is a kind of pre-malignant counterpart called in situ follicular neoplasia that has been identified in the lymph nodes of patients. The question really is, well, you know, about a decade ago, well, if the 1418 isn't enough for the development of follicular lymphoma, what additional genetic or epigenetic events are required? And I think a lot of our understanding of what these genetic events have really been spurred from, you know, advancements in technology, which has evolved over the last decades, and particularly in the last decade, we've had next generation sequencing. This has allowed us to move from studying single genes to multiple genes simultaneously. And we're already moving into a new era where we're able to study these lymphomas not only at a bulk level, but also studying them a single cell at a time. And we're starting to harness the kind of sophisticated computational approaches like artificial intelligence and machine learning to be able to make sense of all this data that we're generating. So if we come back to this sort of heterogeneity and evolution, well, we know for certain that clinically no two patients with follicular lymphoma are alike. And similarly, biologically or genetically, no two patients' lymphomas are alike. There is this interpatient heterogeneity, so what you see on the left-hand side. But also what's quite remarkable is that within a single individual, there is an intrapatient heterogeneity. Their disease actually can change over the course of their disease. So changing their biology of the disease or the genetics of the disease can change over time. But also if we look at different sites of disease from the patient, there are variations between different sites of disease. So their disease is evolving both in space and in time. So if we start with a genetic landscape, so what are the additional events that support the 1418 translocation? Now with well over 1,000 or 2,000 follicular lymphoma patients that have been sequenced, we now have a very good idea of what this sort of genetic encyclopedia is. And what we can see is that many of the mutations are in genes that are involved in epigenetic regulation. So just to name a few here, CREBP, KMT2D, and EZH2. These are all genes that are involved in epigenetic regulation. And what we've now seen from all of these studies is that over 90% of follicular lymphoma patients will have mutations in one, if not more, of these epigenetic modifiers, suggesting to us that epigenetic deregulation is really a fundamental process in the pathogenesis of follicular lymphoma. So I've always sort of scratched my head a little bit about why is there this epigenetic addiction, like I like to call it. And I think that this occurs in follicular lymphoma maybe for a number of reasons. And I think it does that because it kills two birds with one stone. You're essentially mutating epigenetic regulators. So if remember that, epigenetic regulators are important in, regulating, the expression of hundreds to thousands of different genes. So it makes sense to perhaps mutate some of these epigenetic regulators, because then you could control all these genes. So I like to think of the analogy that I like to use is that these mutations in epigenetic regulators are like a conductor in an orchestra. So you could essentially turn on sections of the orchestra that are important. So in the case of lymphoma, they want to turn on sections of the orchestra that will promote a survival, allow it to grow. But at the same time, it may dampen or switch off sections of the orchestra that are detrimental to the lymphoma. For example, turning off immune surveillance mechanisms. And so we're beginning to get a better idea of why these epigenetic regulators are frequently mutated in follicular lymphoma. So let's talk about the intratumor or intrapatient heterogeneity. We know that many of these patients will experience relapses and perhaps transformation during the course of the disease. So the important question to ask was, well, is the biology the same? Is the genetics of disease the same? And we did this we answered this question by looking at patients who underwent transformation and relapse during the course of their disease. And we basically do this by sequencing their lymphomas, follicular lymphomas at diagnosis, and later on when they transformed. And this allows us to take multiple snapshots of the genetic repertoire of the patients as it changes during progression. And just to give you an example here, this is a patient with follicular lymphoma who transforms about 7 years later, and they have a number of episodes of disease progression. By sequencing all of these 4 tumors, we were able to identify that in every single patient, that all their episodes of disease, whether it's relapse or transformation, all arise from some sort of reservoir or progenitor population. And this is this population here that we've affectionately called this population the CPC, the common progenitor cell. We can see that in this patient, for example, there are 29 mutations that are shared across all the 4 tumors. And we think that this represents the genetic signature of this reservoir population that's referred to as the CPC. If we take a closer dive in looking at what are the genetic hallmarks of the CPC population, we recognize very early on, not just us, but many others from around the world, by studying these lymphomas sequentially, is that these mutations in epigenetic regulators feature very early in the disease, suggesting that they are early initiating driver events in the disease, and they are present within this reservoir population. So when I started my PhD, probably about a decade ago, that my goal was to try and identify if there was a common, genetic driver for relapse and transformation. I think it's safe to say that these cancers are very complex, and there is no single or simple genetic explanation for progression or for transformation. We do see that there are certain genetic events that are higher or enriched at transformation and also at progression. And there is something that is common, though. In all of these scenarios, they all have this reservoir population. And this reservoir population, we have a very good idea now of what the genetic signature is of this population. They typically have the 1418 and also epigenetic mutations in these epigenetic regulators. To come back to this kind of reservoir population, we also have another line of evidence to support this. There are these very rare cases of what's referred to as donor-derived follicular lymphoma after stem cell transplantation, and there are 2 cases reported in the literature. The first case is a father and a son, and in this case, the son has acute myeloid leukemia, or a different hematological malignancy. His father acts as his stem cell donor. And 3 and 11 years later, both the father and son developed follicular lymphoma. In the second case are 2 siblings, 2 sisters. The recipient has chronic myeloid leukemia, a different hematological malignancy, and her sister acts as a stem cell donor. And 9 and 10 years later, both the donor and the recipient develop follicular lymphoma. And when the tumors of these, or these lymphomas of both the donor and recipient are sequenced, they're found to have the identical 1418 translocation, shared mutations and VDJ rearrangements, telling us that even at the time of the stem cell transplant, there was already a pre-existing reservoir or precursor that is transplanted into the recipient. So suggesting that this population, or this reservoir population, can be dormant for many, many years before overt lymphoma. So that's looking at patients in time, but what about in space? Many patients present with advanced stage disease. They have disease in multiple lymph nodes, perhaps in their bone marrows as well. And the question is, is the disease dissimilar at different sites of disease? And the simple answer is yes, they are. If you take their biopsies or lymphomas from different sites of disease, they are indeed different. And just to give you an example here, this is a patient of ours where we took the lymphoma from their lymph node and their bone marrow. They have some shared mutations, but what we also begin to see is that there are different clones or subclones of the lymphoma that are propagated in different sites of disease. So in this particular patient, we see that there is this subclone here that has certain mutations, such as EZH2, that is prevalent more in the lymph node over the bone marrow. So if we were to hypothetically treat this patient with an EZH2 inhibitor, we would clear the lymphoma in the lymph node, but not in the bone marrow. So this presents challenges for kind of precision medicine or targeted therapy type of approach, because if you have different targets at different sites, we need to take this into account as well. What's also very interesting is that the spatial heterogeneity, so there's differences in genetic profiles, that seems to worsen as the patients progress. So this is another patient of ours where we looked at the lymphomas both spatially and then when they transformed. At diagnosis, the mutations are pretty similar between the bone marrow and the lymph node, but by the time the patient transforms, you can see they've acquired a whole host of different mutations, some that are only present in the bone marrow and others that are only present in the lymph node. So I like to kind of put this slide up really to kind of remind me and maybe remind the community that there is possibly, there's a reason why we probably aren't curing all patients with follicular lymphoma. I think that we seem very good at using our standard therapies to clear the bulk of the follicular lymphomas, but we are in most patients probably leaving behind this residual repopulating population that we've called the CPC that is perhaps resistant and can lay dormant for many years. And really, maybe this is the population that we need to be focusing on. Can we get a better understanding of what the characteristics of this population is? Can we monitor it? And then perhaps could we target it? Because maybe this could reduce the risk of relapses and transformation. I've mostly talked about genetics because that is my background, but I think it's important to say that genetics is really just one side of the coin. The microenvironment is a very strong driver in follicular lymphoma, and this is just a cartoon from a review that we've done recently. And really there are 2 overriding themes here. Is generally the follicular lymphoma cells sit within a microenvironment that is very supportive and proliferative. So there are signals from the microenvironment to the follicular lymphoma that allows it to be able to thrive in these conditions. And similarly, there are also changes within the follicular lymphoma cells themselves that allows it to modulate the immune response, that allows it to escape surveillance, for example. A lot of this work has been done by phenomenal work from Karen Tart in France, and also by Steve Ansell at the Mayo Clinic and many others from around the world. So I think we have a very good understanding, a better understanding of the microenvironment in follicular lymphoma. So what am I trying to say altogether? I think that, cancers and lymphomas and follicular lymphoma are very complex. I think they sit within a very complex ecosystem. There is heterogeneity within the kind of lymphoma cells themselves. There is also heterogeneity within the microenvironment itself. Probably every patient has a very different microenvironment. And I think that we need to get a better understanding of the interplay between these different components, between the lymphoma cells and the microenvironment, and also within the lymphoma cells themselves, they have different populations. So, we have a lot of knowledge. We have the tsunami of knowledge. Can we actually use this for the betterment of patients? And I'd like to propose that there is, real potential to be able to incorporate biology into what we do. And I think that the way that we can do that is by taking this kind of molecular or biological knowledge and rationalizing them down into specific things. I think that we need to get better at developing predictive biomarkers. We're in this unique position where we have many different treatments. Can we improve the way that we select and tailor our treatments to patients? Could we use some of this biological information to identify improved prognostic biomarkers to identify those patients that are at highest risk of not responding to our standard therapies? Now, one thing that always puzzles me with lymphomas in general is that we're very good at assessing risk at diagnosis, and we typically don't assess risk again later in the disease, perhaps with the exception of Hodgkin's. And so, really these lymphomas are very dynamic and changing over the course of time. And so there is a real question here for us to be able to think about dynamic biomarkers to be able to monitor these lymphomas in real time. And just to give you some examples, I think that, in terms of predictive biomarkers, there's one at the moment. We know that EZH2 mutations are mutated in about 25% of follicular lymphoma patients. We have recently had FDA approval of an EZH2 inhibitor called tazemetostat, and this has arisen from a phase 2 study showing that patients with relapsed refractory follicular lymphoma respond better to tazemetostat if they have the EZH2 mutation. So we can see that these patients overall response rates of 69% compared to 34% in those that are wild type. But really, this is just the first example of a predictive biomarker in follicular lymphoma. Now, what about prognostic biomarkers? We have many. I mean, we started off with FLIPI and FLIPI2, which obviously mostly used clinical parameters, but we're starting to see the incorporation of biological components as well. So the M7 FLIPI is a model that was developed that incorporated clinical as well as the genetic profiles of just 7 genes. And the M7 FLIPI was able to predict both progression-free survival and overall survival. So it could segregate patients into high and low risk. Another tool that was recently developed was based on gene expression of just 23 genes. This was developed from the PRIMA trial and was later confirmed in 3 validation cohorts. Again, you can segregate the patients into low and high risk. It could predict for PFS, but had no effect on overall survival. And a more recent one where we're looking at the microenvironment, and they were able to use just the expression of PDL2 to be able to discriminate if the follicular lymphoma is either immune hot versus immune cold. And in patients that had an immune cold microenvironment, they were at higher risk of progressing or early progression after standard therapies. I still think that many of these tools are still in its first iteration. We're beginning to see that, that there is an impact of treatment. In the previous slide that I showed you, most of these tools were tested in cohorts of patients treated with RCVP or R-CHOP. The M7 FLIPI has been found to not be prognostic in specific cohorts of patients, those that have been treated with chemo-free regimens, for example. And we've also seen that the M7 FLIPI has not been prognostic in the gallium study, where most of the patients have been treated with a bendamustine backbone. And it is thought that the reason for that is because the M7 FLIPI is very heavily weighted in terms of the EZH2 mutations. And you can see here that patients that have EZH2 mutations, whether they're mutated or wild type, it doesn't seem to impact those patients that have a bendamustine treated backbone. And similarly with the PRIMA 23 gene, very recently this was published, that what was shown was the patients that had high risk 23 gene signature actually did better than patients that were low risk, for example. So I think that these tools, the validity and robustness of these tools still need some work, but it's also very dependent on the treatments that we offer our patients. And this is likely to evolve in time. So biomarkers require us to really have the best available tissue. And most of the studies that I showed you previously have mostly worked with frozen tissue. But the reality is that, most of our tissue comes in formalin fix. They're formalin fix, which impacts the quality of the DNA or RNA. We're also doing smaller biopsies. We're, doing core biopsies instead of excision biopsies. So is there an alternative? And can liquid biopsy serve as this alternative? Now, all of us in the room secrete cell-free DNA daily. So do patients with lymphomas. They secrete circulating tumor DNA into their peripheral blood. There is a real impetus potentially to assess these because they're minimally invasive. So collecting peripheral blood in patients may be a way to monitor how their disease is behaving. Can we do this in follicular lymphoma? I think we're still very early days. And just to give you an example that it is possible to track the mutations in the peripheral blood. This is a patient from our center where we were able to identify the mutations in their lymph nodes. So these are the mutations here. And then when we look in the ctDNA of the patient, all of these mutations are detectable, suggesting that we can certainly pick up these mutations and track them in the liquid biopsy. After the patient has treatment, this patient has a couple of cycles of our CHOP, these mutations become undetectable, suggesting that actually that we could use ctDNA as a kind of dynamic surveillance tool, but really we need to explore this in much larger numbers of patients. So as clinicians, what we really want with these tools is we want them to be able to allow us to guide treatment decisions, to be able to identify patients at high risk, to be able to tell us which therapies we should select for our patients. And to do that, we really need tools that are accurate. We really need tools that are actionable, but we also really need tools that are accessible and affordable. And I just like to point where we are at the moment. So for example, all of the tools that I've shown you previously, these molecular tools, don't have a sufficiently high degree of prognostic accuracy yet. So this is just looking at the sensitivity to be able to identify POD24 patients, for example. Also, when we do identify high-risk patients, we're not at a position yet where we actually have a clear approach on how to treat these high-risk patients. So I think we need some more clarity on how to treat these patients, because there's no point identifying them if we don't know how to treat them yet. And of course, it's really important for there to be equity in terms of tools. Is they have to be accessible and affordable. Genotyping, gene expression, ctDNA remain mostly research tools, and they're not standard in the majority of centers. So I've taken you on this sort of whirlwind tour. Where are we in 2021? It's clear that epigenetic deregulation is a key and early driver event in follicular lymphoma. We must remember not to think of it as a single disease. There is heterogeneity between the patients, within the patients, so it's not a single disease. And this heterogeneity can exist both in space and in time. I think that this CPC or the reservoir represent this true sort of Achilles heel of follicular lymphoma. And I think if we have a better understanding of this population, we may make some headway in potentially even curing patients with follicular lymphoma. Where are we in terms of bringing things into the clinic, bringing the biology into the clinic? I think we have a growing number of biology-informed prognostic tools, but they're really just first iterations. Tazemetostat presents the first predictive biomarker in follicular lymphoma, but I really don't think we're there yet. Can we get there? And how can we break some of those bottlenecks? I think that what we have to recognize is that we've had a limited utility of standard biomarkers because of the complexity of these lymphomas, the clonal evolution, the heterogeneity and the immunity of the patients. I think to overcome some of this, we just need to have a much better understanding of these biological phenotypes. We have so many drugs at the moment. How do we choose which one would, what's the right drug for the right patient? And I think to do this, we really need to improve and develop predictive and dynamic biomarkers of response and resistance. And finally, we've got to really, there has to be a sea change in the way that we think about our clinical trials. We use, traditional endpoints like progression-free survival, like overall response rates. These are just, too long to assess for these, and particularly in indolent lymphomas, and it makes the trials very expensive. There are alternate ways that we could use to look at the effectiveness of treatment, potentially by incorporating biological endpoints. And I think this message is really important. I really think we need to maximize our clinical trials and get as much as we can from in terms of the biology. Now, really, a lot of the work that I've shown is some of the work from our group, but also, there is a great FL biology and translational community out there. This was a retreat about 4 or 5 years ago that brought together clinicians, translational researchers, clinician. It's a fantastic meeting where it really just showcasing that although our community is quite small, they're really quite amazing. And also there's a couple of a really excellent female researchers that are doing really, really pioneering work around the world. And really, I sit really on the shoulders of a number of giants. And so I'd just like to end by just really thanking my lab, but also really highlighting that I have a fabulous mentor in Jude Fitzgibbon. My previous supervisor is a fantastic friend, colleague, mentor, counselor. So he continues to be someone that I draw a lot of strength from when I sometimes get lost in the things that I do. Thank you very much to all our collaborators from around the world, and also to our funders. And thank you very much for your attention, and really happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. There's a lot of chat coming through, thanking both our speakers for your fabulous and inspirational talks, and I'd very much like to echo that. And also to thank you for mentioning Jude Fitzgibbon, because that gives me an opportunity just to remind people to tune in, not just to the remaining Wednesdays, but particularly to our one in 3 weeks' time when we've got our male champions of change. Just before we go to some of the questions that have been posted, I just wanted to pick up on the common progenitor cell, Jess, and the reservoir of these that are present in patients regardless of what happens to them going forward. And it's very interesting to see that you can identify the same clone in patients that have undergone multiple relapses and transformation, and that threads through. You mentioned rather tantalizingly that we're starting to understand the genetic makeup of the common progenitor cell. So picking up on Nicola's ambition to cure follicular lymphoma, do you think that that is a realistic possibility, that's one day we could target that? Or do you think the idea of continually profiling these patients dynamically, as you're proposing to do with ctDNA, and then acting in a response and risk adapted way going forward is the way that we're going to stay on top of this disease? Just really interested in your insights on that.
Yeah, I think we probably need a combination of those things. I think that we have a good idea of the genetic fingerprint. So most of these epigenetic mutations are present and likely to be present within this CPC. But, we've never really isolated this population. We've always inferred it, right? And so we really need something to be able to monitor and to be able to track. And so that's why I think that one avenue could be targeting the genetic fingerprints of this population, but also similarly monitoring the patients to try and understand how their disease is behaving with each treatment that we give them. I like to kind of use, I think a lot of people think that, biologically we're done with, we've sequenced the two lymphomas and, we should be there. But actually, I sort of always think about this sort of Winston Churchill phrase where he sort of says, really, we're just the kind of, end of the beginning, really, in terms of our discovery. There's still a whole lot more that we need to, to explore. And to answer these questions, we really need samples to be able to, we need patient samples to be able to analyze the heterogeneity, follow the patients through. So, the two avenues that you propose, I think we have to pursue them in parallel.
Thank you, Jess.
Okay, thank you, Jess. We have very little time. Thank you for an excellent lecture, but I have a question from the audience regarding, is there any translational hypothesis and interventions that we could do to prevent transformation in follicular lymphoma?
Oh, it's like, I think I was going to spend my career doing this, right? So, I think, from the studies that has been done, not just by me, but many others from around the world, we can see that that when patients transform, their disease becomes more genetically unstable. So they acquire more mutations. They acquire mutations in TP53, for example, or MYC, for example. These mutations are not usually detectable at diagnosis. So it's not possible yet to be able to predict whether the patients are able to transform. There are a number of other things that we can start to explore. Is that, are they things other than mutations that could represent the signature of transformation at diagnosis. And if we could identify that in some way, perhaps we'll be able to predict if patients were going to transform. So I think at this juncture, we don't have enough information to be able to predict who is likely to transform and who isn't.
And Jess, one more thing. When we hear about this great genetic heterogeneity and we look forward and we look at the classification we're using today for follicular lymphoma, it feels like it is too short, too easy classification. Maybe in the future we could classify follicular lymphoma in a diverse group of different follicular lymphomas. And do you think that could be possible and that could help us in future clinical trials to get better personalized therapy in this disease?
No, I completely agree, Astrid. I think that we've seen it in DLBCL, haven't we? That, we've, for 2 decades, we kept umming and ahhing about ABC and GCB, and then suddenly there are 5 to 7 different molecular subtypes. I suspect that we will see that in follicular as well, that there are probably different molecular subtypes, probably not as diverse as DLBCL. It might allow us to be able to identify groups of patients that probably will, that will not respond as well to standard therapies. But to do that, you need very large number of patients to be studied. And I think we're starting to see some of that information coming through. I think there were a couple of talks at Lugano this year that were starting to show that they are these molecular subtypes. And perhaps the WHO classification will change again in due course once we have this information. But I think that these lymphomas are very heterogeneous. So we will see an evolution of classification.
So just final question, thank you, about how we design our future generation of clinical trials so that we can better address the unanswered biological questions and building some of the predictive and prognostic biomarker work that you do, some of the dynamic surveillance work that you do. I guess you're perhaps advocating for us to biopsy multiple sites from patients and maybe go back to bone marrow biopsies, but just would be interested in your thoughts about how we can get cleverer in building the science back into our trials so that we can, what we've got at the moment is, as you said, a lot of molecules, but we really have no idea what to do with them. How can we work out how to use these molecules, how to sequence these molecules, and at the same time delve into the biology that can help us to personalize treatment?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Kim. I think probably multiple ways to do it. I think that we have, as you say, many drugs in the relapse refractory setting. I think that one of the things that is critically important is for correlative science to be built into all of these studies. I've been a strong proponent for this. We need to understand the patients that are having CAR T, why are some responding, why aren't some responding, and we need to have the samples from the patients to understand that. So in other words, identifying predictive biomarkers of response to certain therapies. So I think that's certainly one avenue. In terms of other ways that we can be clever, I think that it has to be an iterative process by in parallel studying the biology and then bringing that information back into future clinical trial designs. I think it has to always be very iterative. We're not at a point at this juncture to be able to use nothing can be biology guided at the moment. I don't think we can certainly assess it as we go along currently, but I think that we have to, if we don't start now with the correlative studies, then we just will never develop biology guided trials.
Thank you so much, Jess.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all. I think we're running out of time. We could go on talking and asking, but I want to give a sincere thanks to both Nicola and Jess for very inspiring lectures that we just heard. I want to thank the steering committee from the WiLing steering committee and all our participants that are were here with us today. We also want to thank the Snowdown Foundation for their continued support for the WiLing community and our 3 sponsors today, the Beijing, BMS, and Janssen Australia. And I hope we keep growing as a WiLing community and we see each other in future sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
And thank you, Kim, for co-chairing with me.
Pleasure, Astrid. Thank you.
Bye-bye.